Good afternoon or good morning. My name's Tracy Mehan. I'm Executive Director for Government Affairs with something called the American Water Works Association. We've got 50,000 members, all of whom work in the drinking water or support the drinking water utility sector. I moved to Washington in 2001, 68 square miles surrounded by reality. And it's been an experience working in the Safe Drinking Water area and the Clean Water Act area. I feel coming to a conference like this like I'm a drowning man who just broke the surface and got a deep breath of fresh air. It is probably the two areas with the most command and control, consistently command and control approach to the regulatory regime. And that's layered on top of a sector which is, and I say this in a very clinical way, a very socialized sector that is embedded in government, primarily municipal government, with a small sector of investor-owned utility. So to hear these rather inspiring conversations about markets and incentives matter, it reminds me of going to a PERC meeting, and I appreciate that very much. So today we're talking about, could be a very broad topic, but regulation in theory and practice, but the context for the discussion this morning will be on climate, energy transition, permitting and tax incentives and disincentives. And we have two very fine speakers. Some of you may be familiar with them. Starting on the far left, Andrew Waxman is Assistant Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the Department of Economics at the University of Texas in Austin. He was a visiting scholar at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he also has an affiliate relationship with Cornell Institute for China Economic Research, and I understand he's a graduate of the fine institution here in Palo Alto. So it's welcome, Andrew, and he's going to talk about some issues involving tax policy relative to areas of climate policy. James Coleman, on my immediate left, is law professor at the University of Minnesota and a non-resident fellow here at AEI in Washington. He's taught at several schools, and he practiced with Sidley and Austin, a very prominent national law firm in the Washington, D.C. office. And he clerked in my home old circuit at the 8th Circuit for Judge Culleton for the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. He was a biology major at Harvard, and with his undergraduate thesis, actually was able to have a Central Asian butterfly named after him, which is a pretty remarkable distinction that most of us cannot claim. So with that, the program is going to be pretty simple. I've introduced both our speakers. They're going to give 2 10-minute or so presentations, and then we'll enter into some discussion either here or with the audience, depending on who gets their hand up first, me or you. So, James, do you want to kick it off?
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll step around here. Great, thank you. These, by the way, I have these slides. I just posted them on my Twitter or X, what have you. So if you're looking for those slides, they're right there at Energy Law Prof. And I'll be focusing on why permitting has become such a central topic for our energy future, for all of the new energy sources that we want to build, and to whether we're able to build a more secure, affordable, and cleaner energy system. And I'll really have 2 big topics. One is something that may be a little bit surprising, which is this paradox that as we've had global policy shifts, as well as economic shifts, toward more use of electricity for life-critical services like driving, like heating your home, and to renewables within the electricity sector, that has maybe, ironically, increased our dependence, particularly on natural gas, and our reliance on new pipelines, and increased the need for, in some instances, new fossil fuel infrastructure. And I'll talk about the example of natural gas, but I understand Andrew's going to be talking about the example of carbon capture and carbon pipelines as well. So, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges that we're facing as we try to build infrastructure to support those new energy supply chains. So let's start with this sort of paradox that as we've had this increasing use of electricity, as well as a transfer of some services that have traditionally relied on burning fuels to electricity, that has maybe ironically increased our dependence on natural gas and natural gas pipelines. Now, of course, some of those electricity shifts is a result of this increase in electricity use. A lot of it is about new data centers, artificial intelligence, and we've seen the the locations of that have kind of been localized in a couple different places around the United States, particularly Virginia, but you see, not too far behind, you see Texas and California as the second and third leader in data centers, and I think we'll see a lot more in some of those places going forward, as well as maybe broader distribution around the country. You can also see that for those places that have increased have been installing data centers, those are also some of the places that we've had the greatest electricity load, and that electricity load has largely come from natural gas as well as from solar and wind. And you can see a place like Virginia, it's mostly come from natural gas. You see that in orange there on the right side of the graph at the top. And then you see in Texas, a lot of natural gas, increasing electricity production from natural gas in orange, but even more from solar and wind. We've seen just at times last year, Texas was adding more solar and wind than every other state in the nation combined. So at the same time that we have seen this boost in electricity use, a lot of it tied to data centers, tied to crypto, we have also, of course, have policy pushes to take parts of our energy system that have historically relied on burning fuels, like gasoline in your vehicles or natural gas to heat your house, and shifted them to dependence on electricity, like electric vehicles, like heat pumps for your house. Now, one big challenge that we'll talk a lot more about today is that as we go towards more dependence on electricity for those life-critical services, like can you heat your house, like if you can't heat your house, can you drive to somewhere safe, at the same time, our electricity system is growing less reliable. And we can see that in multiple ways. So one way is if we look at our reliability watchdog, NERC, you can see it puts out these regular reports, and increasingly we're seeing areas in orange that are at elevated risk of blackouts or shortages of electricity, as well as red, which are at very high risk for those electricity. And those regions change from season to season and from year to year, but we're seeing increasing danger of that. And that's also showing up in our data on electric power interruptions, which is that over time, as we're trying to grow more dependent on electricity, our electric system is growing less reliable with more and more outages. All right. Now, if we look at where does that electricity come from, it's relatively easy at the current moment because this is showing our sources of electricity in the United States, and 2/5 comes from our biggest source, which is natural gas. Then we get 1/5 each from coal, from renewables, and from nuclear. And you can also see in this chart a trend which is toward more use of natural gas, more use of renewables, and you can see coal falling off. Now those trends are projected to continue. In fact, they have continued. This chart ends in 2020. If you were to go forward a couple more years, you would see that continuing, and they're projected to continue for decades to come. Because if you see what kind of power sources on the left side of this chart were built over the past 20 years, it's mostly in light blue, natural gas, as well as solar and wind in green and yellow, and the projection is for more of those to be built going forward. You can see what's being shut down below the line, a lot of coal, as well as some nuclear, and more projected to be shut down in coming years. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in some ways this increased use of renewables has actually led to more dependence on natural gas. And the reason for that is a fundamental fact you need to understand about this electricity system that we're moving to dependence on is that the electricity system always has to exactly balance how much power is being used by millions of consumers every time they flip on a light switch or plug in their electric vehicle or turn up their electric heat. It has to balance that with the power that's being provided by thousands of power plants. And that's very challenging to do. How do we do that? Well, this is just a day of power use in Texas a couple weeks ago, just a random day. Nothing went wrong this day. And what you can see here is the overall use of power over the course of the day from midnight to midnight. You can see that after midnight, people go to sleep, power use drops, then during the day they wake up and you get a peak of demand often either in the middle of the day or in the early evening hours. Now, the colors are showing you what sources of power are meeting that demand over the course of the day. And you see in the middle of the day a huge amount of solar coming on the grid in Texas. You would see a similar story, even more solar proportionally here in California. But here you can see how natural gas and renewables work very well together. Because when that solar comes on the grid, you can see natural gas ramping down to to basically make room for solar on the grid, because you can't have more power than demanded or less power than demanded. And you can see that in the early evening hours, when we're still almost at peak demand, solar goes away entirely. And so that's why you still need to have sources on the grid that can meet the full demand even without help from solar. And you can actually, I think a lot of people may have an intuitive understanding of that with respect to solar. So if you're looking at these GIFs on the top right, you're seeing a wave of solar power going across the United States from east to west during the middle of the day. But there's also a diurnal or daily pattern to wind power over the course of the day, which you might be less aware of unless you go outside at 4 a.m. in the morning, which is that the wind power tends to peak in the early morning hours. And unfortunately, that's when we least need power. So neither of these power sources tend to provide power when we most need power in most of the country, which is those early evening hours. Okay, now that creates a challenge every day, but there's a bigger challenge seasonally. And to understand that, I think it's important to understand what happened in Texas in 2021 during the major outage. So this is a picture of power being provided to the Texas grid over the first 2 weeks of February 2021. And what you see on the left-hand side, that first week of February, is the Texas grid operating as it's supposed to. So often, the biggest source of power in red is wind power, but when wind isn't available, in orange, natural gas ramps up to take its place. You can see that something changed dramatically in that second week of February 2021. And what changed? Well, basically, it got very cold. And often, when it gets very cold in Texas, that means you don't have very much wind power available. That's not because wind turbines freeze, although there was a little bit of that. It's mostly just because there isn't wind. It might have a high pressure system sitting over. And so sometimes you don't have that wind power when you most need it. So what happens? Well, natural gas began by doing what it was supposed to and ramping up to meet all of that unprecedented demand, because Texas is ahead of both of those trends that I talked about. We're more likely to use electricity for heat, and we're more likely to use renewable power. But you can see that after natural gas ramped up to unprecedented amounts, in the early morning hours of February 15th, something bad happened because everybody stopped producing so much power. Well, what happened? Well, remember how I said that the grid always has to exactly balance how much power is being provided by being used by millions of consumers with how much is being produced by thousands of power plants. Well, as people used more and more power, those fell out of balance for a couple minutes in the middle of the night on Valentine's Day, February 15th, 2021. And so you can see here that this is basically from 1:20 a.m. to 2 a.m. So it's about a little over a half an hour. And you can see the frequency of the grid changing. Why is that important? Well, the frequency of the grid always has to oscillate at 60 times per second, 60 hertz. And by doing that, it maintains all the machines, all the power plants connected to the grid in sync. If the frequency falls at all, which it does when power demanded and supplied falls out of balance, everything connected to the grid starts to break. All of those machines, all of those natural gas power plants, and to protect themselves, they'll often trip themselves off the grid, which creates an even bigger chain reaction because even less power provided to the grid. Well, there was a 10-minute chain reaction that changed the frequency in the middle of the night on February 15th. And that led to 4 days of outages because we found another chain reaction in the grid, which is that our natural gas supplies, which are increasingly our only dependable supply of electricity, are also dependent on the electricity system. So to stop this chain reaction, the Texas grid regulator had to turn off power to half of Texans. But the problem is that also turned off natural gas supplies to a lot of Texas natural gas power plants. And so we're increasingly seeing these two chain reactions. One is power used and demanded falls out of balance. And two is, if we have any kind of outage, it can take longer to recover from because the natural gas system itself is dependent on constant electricity supplies. Okay, so this is the challenge. We're moving toward more dependent on electricity, but toward less dependable electricity sources. And the only way we're able to address that is by massively increasing the capacity of our natural gas system to meet some of those peak uses of demand. Both the natural gas system and the power system basically have to be sized to meet peak demand. So lowering average demand doesn't actually help you that much economically. It only, you have to be able to meet that peak demand. Okay. So another giant challenge that we're facing, along with assuring this reliability of supply, is also the security of supply. in the case of oil and gas, we maybe have taken for granted the fact that the United States for most of the past 120 years has been the biggest producer of both oil and natural gas. And as you heard 2 presentations ago, there was a time when we were importing a lot of oil, but with the, the real development, further development of shale resources, the U.S. kind of came roaring back and now is by far the world's #1 oil producer and natural gas producer. That gives us a lot of strategic strength in many senses. One is that we have huge stores of oil. We have those government stores of oil that we kind of half emptied over the course of 2022 in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but we also have private stores of oil. Together, those could meet about 3 months of U.S. oil demand, even if you didn't have any production stopped, which it never would, but went to 0 immediately. And that provides a lot of security that we take for granted in our energy system. Think about the contrast between that system and the electricity system. In that system, for the year of 2021, for that entire year, we were producing 2 million barrels less per day than we consumed as a globe. How did we get through that? Well, we had stores that we drew down over that time period, even though we were 2 million barrels short every day. By contrast, think about the electricity system. There is an imbalance for just 10 minutes in the middle of the night, and it causes this giant catastrophe. You can think of Spain and Portugal, where the shortage was really, it's more like 5 seconds, right? So that was only about an imbalance of 5 seconds, and it caused, a day-long giant, not to the extent of what happened in Texas, but very, very concerning. Okay, now, how can we introduce more flexibility into the system that we're operating? One side of it, of course, is natural gas pipelines to access these resources and ensure that we have the throughput capacity to meet peaks in demand. But another huge and important part of it, of course, is waterborne natural gas and through liquefied natural gas. And the reason that's so important is because those vessels, they're $250 million refrigerated vessels, can be sent wherever they're needed overseas. And that played a crucial role in allowing Europe to survive the cutoff of Russian gas, because the U.S. basically went to the #1 producer of liquefied natural gas, exporter of liquefied natural gas overnight, and that allowed Europe to survive those winters after Russia's cutoff. Okay, there's other hugely important parts of infrastructure that we need to be focused on building. So one is, of course, carbon capture pipelines to try and reduce the carbon impact of these continued burning of fossil fuels. Now, we'll hear more about the tax credits, but I think the important thing to understand right now is these pipelines are having a very difficult time in the regulatory process because they're permitted state by state. And we've seen increasing opposition to all kinds of infrastructure that are needed for all these new energy sources. So that includes these carbon capture pipelines, 2 of which of these projects have already been shelved. And we can see, I would say maybe the pessimistic future is that carbon capture ends up like solar and wind, where mostly it just happens in Texas, and it really isn't able to get off the ground in the same way around the rest of the country because of the challenge of coordinating interstate infrastructure. Okay. So I will note that this is also a giant challenge for power lines. So if you know in the Inflation Reduction Act, basically we authorized over $1 trillion in spending that was supposed to get us 80% of the way to achieving the goals that the Biden administration had in terms of carbon reduction. After they passed that more than $1 trillion in spending, there was a new study that released that said, oh, by the way, sorry, we're not going to get any of those benefits. We're going to get maybe 20% at best, unless we start building 10 times as many power lines as we're currently building. And you can see that the trend in our power line construction over time has not been positive, because again, these projects are so difficult to permit. And I hope we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. So here's my last slide, and it relates to relates to something that Samantha and Scott were talking about earlier, which is that, of course, the U.S. has maybe taken for granted this incredible strength in oil and gas production, where we've been the #1 global producer of both oil and gas. We don't have anything like that kind of strength in any of the mineral markets that we need for any of these new projects that we're contemplating. So we're not in the top 10 producer of most of those important commodities like cobalt and lithium. And as I believe Samantha said, the story is even worse when it comes to processing. So when you look at those supply chain, where are those clean energy metals produced? Well, they're mostly not in the United States. But if you look at where they're processed, those supply chains, basically a plurality of supply chain processing goes through China. And so China is, obviously a strategic competitor, and that creates massive insecurity for the US. And I think it sort of raises this question, which Scott maybe mentioned, which is, so to what extent does this mean that mean we need to sort of double down on producing these supply chains here as fast as possible? As we know from all the permitting challenges we've talked about, that will be very difficult. Does that mean we have to slow down in terms of our dependence on, pushing our dependence on these minerals? Or are there ways that we can, friend source some of these mineral supply chains so that they happen in friendly countries and provide us with something approaching the kind of security that we've long taken for granted in oil and gas? So with that, I very much look forward to the discussion.
First of all, thanks very much, Terry and Nick, for inviting me to be here. This is great. It's great to be in this audience and with a mixed group with very different and interesting backgrounds. So I'm going to narrow into a very specific topic, one that I mentioned earlier, and it's been kind of recently rebranded as this thing called carbon management. And so let me talk about what that means. We mentioned earlier carbon capture. So carbon capture is one form of carbon management, which is sort of a broad mosaic of different ways of managing CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. Up in the top left, you can see what's called point source capture. So that's sort of what we have in mind when we think about that. You have a large power plant or a large cement clinker. You've got a capture chemical tower for which the CO2 gets scrubbed and then compressed, put in a pipeline, which is where you see transport, and was the permitting issue they mentioned earlier, and then piped underground, principally into two types of uses. One in saline aquifers, in which case it gets stored in the pore space, ideally indefinitely, or number two, in the case of enhanced oil recovery, into oil and gas wells, which is used to bring principally enhanced oil resources that are more expensive to remove without CO2, and that gas brings them up to the surface. There are other things that fall within this, including green cement. And one thing that I'll touch on briefly is, and I think some of the other talks we'll talk about a little bit as well, is carbon dioxide removal or direct air capture, which is another way of trying to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. There's three basic parts to point source carbon capture, and I'm an economist, so I'm going to try and keep it brief because the engineers and geologists do a much better job of talking about this. You've got CO2 that is otherwise coming from an industrial facility or a power plant. It goes through a chemical process that then gets transported in pipelines and then pumped underground into some form of a well. This is what direct air capture looks like. This is a demonstration facility in Iceland where you have these fan jets that pull CO2 from the atmosphere. It goes through a heat transfer and then CO2 comes out. So why are we talking about this? One of the things that was discussed earlier is that in these plans that the UN, the IPCC, or this is the International Energy Agency, have for their sort of net zero goals, whether they're realistic or not, they all pretty much agree that some, and in some cases a significant amount of this needs to come from converting existing fossil fuel generation into fossil fuel where the CO2 gets captured and put underground. And the focus of this in particular are in what are called hard to abate sectors. So this is a number of things, and you can see this on the right side of the graph. So at the bottom, what's called load following electricity, which is the type of natural gas and coal plants that were mentioned earlier that need to come online in response to intermittency with solar and renewables. One of the challenges, maybe we can talk about during the break, is that actually at the moment we don't have the ability to ramp carbon capture on and off, and so that's actually still a really hard problem. Other applications are industrial things that are really hard to electrify. You can't very easily electrify a cement plant or a metals facility or a paper plant. And so trying to figure out ways, or the transportation sector is the third one, trying to find ways to deal with the CO2 emissions from those sectors are a big question. So this is a really confusing graph that's part of one of those IPCC reports, but basically argues that it's going to be almost impossible to reduce CO2 emissions to our mid-century climate goals without relying substantially on carbon capture in a real substantial way. And so what are we doing in the US? Well, there is a federal tax credit that was put into effect in 2008 under the Obama administration. It was subsequently increased during the Trump administration, and again in the Inflation Reduction Act in the Biden administration. And so many have argued that this tax credit is the only true bipartisan climate policy, because it's one in which both Democrats and Republicans seem to some degree to agree upon in order to reduce CO2 emissions. And so you can see on the graph on the right here, this is the level of the credit. It varies depending upon what the form of capture is, that is to say whether it's on directly on a power plant or industrial facility, or doing direct air capture, which is a higher level, and then depending upon whether that CO2 goes into a saline aquifer where it stays indefinitely, or it goes into an enhanced oil recovery well, which gets a lower credit. So currently, under the Inflation Reduction Act, the amount of the credit is $85 per ton of CO2. If that's going into saline aquifer, it's a lower amount if it goes for enhanced oil recovery. It's about $180 per ton if it's used for direct air capture. So these are substantial amounts of money. And you can see in a study by the Congressional Budget Office, as well as researchers affiliated through the Brookings Institution, they've shown that the order of magnitude of the outlay of federal revenues is on the order of a few billion per year, could be as much as 10 billion by 2030. Sorry, I lost my slides. There we go. So how does this credit compare to alternative policies? This is a session about markets versus mandates. So this is in principle a kind of price mechanism that allows the private sector to adjust. If the subsidy incentivizes adoption, they may adopt. If they don't, they may not. But it doesn't do quite the same thing as something like a carbon tax, because essentially, while they may on the margin do similar types of behavior, a carbon tax is going to make it expensive to emit CO2 emissions. This makes it profitable to store those emissions underground. If you're a firm that's barely profitable, a subsidy is going to help you be profitable, and a tax is going to hurt your profitability. And so this is a subsidy that has the potential to kind of make what quote unquote gray industries more profitable and expand the size of their market share, which could be good or bad depending upon your perspectives, but that's a difference in the design of this. One thing that was mentioned earlier in the session with Samantha Gross and others was about the importance of research and development. So one of the arguments for this credit is that it's an early investment by the federal government to try to develop the technological resources to make this technology cheaper so that industry can use it at large scale. One thing I'll point out is that in the absence of a subsidy, industry in most cases doesn't have any incentive to continue to do it. So this is something that the federal government is going to have to be on the hook for indefinitely. They can get some revenue back in the form of enhanced oil recovery, but otherwise, if it's going underground in deep aquifers, we're going to have to keep subsidizing it. Oops, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. So a few more things before I finish up here. So at the moment, there are 19 operational large-scale carbon capture projects. Large-scale means 800,000 tons of CO2 per year or more. And this is being used on a number of things. There is one fossil-fueled coal plant that's operational. That's the Petronova facility in my home state of Texas. But it's being used for other things like ethanol production and biofuels. That's part of what's happening in the Midwest. Those pipelines that have been challenging to permit have been associated with fertilizer, coal gasification, gas compression, and hydrogen. The majority of carbon capture at large scale is used for enhanced oil recovery. So of those 19 projects, 15 are enhanced oil recovery. The sort of net climate impact calculus is going to be a little bit different because you're getting a barrel of oil out. Now that barrel of oil generates, economic benefits and profits, et cetera, but the net CO2 reduction is going to be smaller depending upon whether that barrel of oil displaces a barrel of oil in international markets that doesn't have EOR or whether it's additional. And one last thing I'm not going to spend a ton of time on, but a really interesting aspect of this coast problem that was mentioned earlier by Gary is the question of where do you put the CO2, right? And so there's a federal permitting program the same way we permit oil and gas wells. It's called a Class 6 permit. It's one of the most onerous permitting processes to go through to get these injection wells sited and set up. And there's a huge question about who owns the pore space underground. And folks in law schools, have done a ton of research trying to figure out, in part based on different state laws about who owns that subsurface pore space. How do you think about coming up with contracts to deal with that? And I hit that button again. Another thing that was mentioned by Samantha Gross is ignoring the role of thermodynamics. And one thing I just want to mention is while direct air capture, which is sort of a zero emissions technology, you're pulling CO2 from the atmosphere, sounds very appealing, it's very expensive because you're using something that is much lower concentration of CO2 than what comes out of a CO2 pipeline. I mean, the cheapest thing is to reduce CO2 emissions at the beginning. But if you can't do that, pulling them out of the flue gas from a coal power plant is going to be the cheapest thing to do. If you want to do DAC, which is up at the top left, this is going to have the highest costs because the CO2 is the most diffuse in the atmosphere relative to other applications. Where is it most cost effective? So I have some work doing this, and this is why, as James mentioned earlier, that the Gulf is one of the places where this is the most likely to happen because you've got increasing returns to scale, and the technology itself is heavily capital intensive. And so the places where the federal subsidy, which is that red line you can see at the top at $85 per ton, is the most effective is for applications in particular clusters around the Gulf in Louisiana and Texas. And I think with that, I'll just mention a few other things, which is that there are a few technical issues about who owns the pore space that I mentioned. How do we deal with long-term liability of the wells associated with the carbon capture? How do we coordinate to deal with permitting issues of the pipelines? And then what happens after the credit expires? It's not really an investment tax credit. It's not really a production tax credit. It's somewhere in between. And so the federal government's going to have to figure out how to thread that needle at the end. And last but not least, I have a little bit of work looking at the air pollution co-benefits or co-damages. So if we want to think about those impacts, environmental impacts that Gary mentioned earlier, in some cases, carbon capture may reduce pollution, local air pollution. In some cases, it may increase it. Thanks very much. Look forward to questions.
James and Andrew, thank you very much. Quick question, Andrew. This is regulated under what, the Underground Injection Program?
Yes, that's right.
The Safe Drinking Water Act. And is it also regulated under the Clean Air Act? Do they have to get clean air permits?
So power plants have to get, as part of the new source and existing source review process under the Clean Air Act, have to get, they have to get, if they're going to use carbon capture, it has to be part of that. And when they redid Section 111D in 2024, part of that was it was initially going to mandate that both coal and natural gas plants move on to transition paths that involved carbon capture. And then the gas plants, because it's more expensive, they decided to take them off, and there was a lot of lobbying against that. And so what came out of that was that coal plants were on a transition, I think, by 2033 to start to have that. And that's an interesting aspect of a kind of mandate. Under the new presidential administration, there's a different approach to thinking about that. And so that's kind of off the table.
Very different, yeah. James, I'm going to call an audible here and ask a little different question than maybe we discussed. But if I'm hearing you right, the problem of building out the necessary infrastructure is both a NIMBY and a federalism problem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I think there is, everybody understands that if you have to get interstate infrastructure built, you're going to have challenge because most of that infrastructure has to receive state approval. So if you're talking about power lines, oil pipelines, carbon capture, hydrogen pipelines, those are all going to need approval from each state, and that creates natural holdup problems where states feel like they're getting a bad deal and are going to try and stop those projects. So one common solution that's proposed, and we saw Senator Manchin propose this, is, well, maybe we should federalize that. So we should have more federal approvals for interstate power lines.
Preemption?
Yeah, exactly. Or more federal approvals for hydrogen pipelines. Now, as somebody who follows this closely, that doesn't look like much of a solution to me for another reason, which is that the federal permitting process itself is notoriously slow. As we know with the National Environmental Policy Act, there are efforts to improve it, but right now it's a slow process. And the second reason is that there is one kind of interstate infrastructure that already receives federal permitting, and that's natural gas pipelines. It already gets federal permitting, and those projects have not had an easy time with the federal process because included in that federal process is an ability for states to basically veto those projects under the Clean Water Act, Section 401. Right. And so I think there's sometimes this naive sense, well, if the states are holding it up, let's just give it to the federal government. That itself creates some problems. So I think you need really to have a two-step where one, maybe you give more federal authority, but then two, you make it easier for the federal government to approve those projects, even if maybe one state doesn't like it.
Yep, very good. Let's, we've got about 15 and a half minutes. Anyone in the audience want to posit a question? We'll start with Gary.
So help me understand the incentive or the rationale for the federal government to subsidize carbon capture if China and India and probably Africa, as they grow, are going to and are releasing more and more carbon into the atmosphere. What's the net effect of this expensive operation in the U.S. if elsewhere, since this is a global externality, elsewhere they're dumping lots and lots of stuff into the atmosphere?
Yeah, it's a great challenge. I mean, part of this relies on kind of global coordination, and the question is whether that happens or not, and we're not in a great era right now of coordination. I will say that China is already doing carbon capture itself. Part of that is sort of for, in part to, for audience effects, for kind of, global environmental and climate policy. I would say, a little bit more, in terms of, rent seeking, there are states that have pursued this technology as a way to try and keep particularly coal online, because you can use the subsidies for carbon capture on coal technology, which generates a ton of CO2, to help keep those plants operational. And so states like Wyoming and states like West Virginia have been really gung-ho about moving forward with this technology because coal plants are retiring, because independent of environmental policy, they're not as economical relative to natural gas as they used to be. And so this is a mechanism to try and keep those plants still online. That's not necessarily an economic efficiency argument, but it is a political economy argument.
I was going to raise one question on NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. This was the first of the first wave of it was actually 69 environmental law. This is where the phrase environmental impact statement comes from. Could you talk about the convergence and the argument and the concerns from sort of left and right in terms of the old industrial concerns with 7,000-page EIS studies, and now environmentalists concerned about the same problem with their favorite projects?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the U.S. has gone to a very different model of climate regulation based on spending. So most of the world has, and I think we're going to hear talks about this maybe coming up, has looked at cap and trade, carbon pricing, like you see in British Columbia, or actually across Canada, there's different models. The U.S., for a combination of reasons, including the perceived unpopularity of carbon pricing, as well as the need to do something through reconciliation, so you could do it with 50 votes plus the vice president, has chosen a basically spending mostly or spending only approach to reducing carbon emissions. And because, as we talked about, that means subsidizing, cleaner sources of energy, effectively, that's only going to result in carbon emission reductions to the extent that those new sources outcompete fossil fuel sources, and as a result, they potentially shut down. So it puts a huge premium on deployment. And, in particular, the nightmare scenario here is something like high-speed rail, where the federal government spent billions of dollars on it starting in 2009. And you all can tell me if we're going to have high-speed rail anytime soon, I guess. So the big concern is this expenditure, $1 trillion. I mean, if it's $1 trillion, $2 trillion.
And the point is, if you got federal money, you got to follow NEPA,
right,
as opposed to a private compliance.
Well, and at the basic level, you need to get things permitted. So if you're building a solar farm, you can often build it on private land, so maybe you're going to avoid an extensive NEPA process. But the reality is the limiting factor for solar and wind is transmission, building the power lines to connect it, and a lot of it's supposed to be in the West where it's going to cross federal lands, and so you're going to either go through these onerous state-by-state permitting processes, or you might have layered on top of that a federal process that's extremely long. So I think the permitting challenge for solar and wind often, absolutely applies to the solar farms and the wind farms, but the bigger challenge is the transmission, which is what they really need to deploy on a large scale.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
One of the things I've noticed in the levelized cost of solar, if you go listen to almost any news program, it'll say solar is the cheapest there is. I have solar on my house, and I'm happy with it, and I'm saving a lot of money. But I'm an engineer, and I guess looking for truth. Why in the levelized costs don't they include something for the natural gas backup or batteries or something, or even the cost of all this grid? I know it's a little bit more difficult to calculate, but it doesn't look like we're getting the truth from a levelized cost. Is that correct?
I think that it's important, and I would encourage any reporters in the room distinguish between the levelized cost of electricity and the cost of a system based on that. I mean, I always think it's like somebody told you, hey, hitchhiking is free, so I'm going to sell my car and hitchhike, and if sometimes there's not somebody going to pick me up, well, I'll just Uber, right? you know, it's true. Hitchhiking is cheap. I mean, I think you should pay for gas, but still, I mean, it's quite cheap, right? But the reality is you might spend up more money over that given how often you're relying on Uber or Lyft rather than just your car that can take you wherever you need to go. And so I think it's just, you know, I do think levelized cost has its own unique things, but it really has nothing to do with what percentage of power sources we should be using, and it should be made clear in that context. You know, I think often people will say something even more colloquial, which is just solar is very cheap, and I think that's too simplistic to. I mean, I do think that is deceiving if you don't say something about, but of course it doesn't provide us, we can't build a system based on solar, or at least we'd have to spend a lot of money on backup.
Do you want to weigh in on that, Andrew?
Fraudulent, I mean, you said deceiving. It seems to me it's almost fraudulent.
I think a lot of times it's not done with the intent to deceive. I think a lot of people don't understand. I mean, you know, having talked to a lot of people who should know better, I think a lot of times they frankly just don't understand that, hey, we always have to, I mean, they think of it like gasoline, right? Go to the cheapest station and you can fill up another week later. That's not how our power system operates. I think it's very poorly understood the consequences of the fact that it always has to be exactly balanced. And if it falls out of balance for 5 seconds, you know, the whole country loses power.
Andrew, do you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, just that the levelized cost is a useful engineering calculation, but that the social cost that when I plug my car in and pull, a kilowatt hour of electricity out is a different cost. It's going to reflect the set of energy that's kind of on the margin, that's economical at that particular time of day, at that particular location. That may not be the same thing as levelized cost. It also may not be the same thing as a ratepayer as what I pay my electricity utility. And the fact that there's differences between those has different implications for how we make ideal investments in the grid and also how people make choices about what they want to use.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Andrew to elaborate on the local air pollution effects of carbon capture. Like, how does that process work, and is it a big deal?
I think it is a big deal in a number of different ways. So, one of the big legacies of coal, and Gary had talked about kind of local versus, global or national kind of costs from energy use, is that we know that sulfur dioxide and secondary particulates that come as a result of that actually can travel long distances, and coordination around that can be a challenging policy issue. And dealing with coal and its impacts has been a huge part of kind of environmental policy and environmental health impacts. Carbon capture, in order to capture the CO2 from a coal power plant, you have to deal with the SO2. You basically have to scrub it. And so one of the co-benefits of running coal with carbon capture is that you remove the majority of the air pollutants associated with it. And in particular, the big killer, the silent killer, is the secondary particulate matter, 2.5 microns and smaller. When you use carbon capture on other applications like natural gas plants or industrial plants, you don't have as much sulfur dioxide because it's actually the burning of coal that produces all that SO2. And as a result, in particular air basins, I have a little bit of work that essentially the conventional technology, so was mentioned earlier, was about kind of what's technologically ready right now for the market, is this thing called amine-based post-combustion capture, which is basically a nitrogen-based solvent that pulls the CO2 out. That produces ammonia emissions, which have real human health impacts. And so you can get potentially air pollution damages as well as benefits. And so there's a really interesting question about how do you balance global benefits from doing carbon capture with local air pollution costs and benefits.
Isn't that going to be covered in the air permits?
So ammonia is not a criteria air pollutant, right? And so,
but can't they add that on the permit as a matter of state delegated authority?
If there is regulatory will
to do
Texas. So. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I'm sorry, they're right here in the, sir.
Just a comment about coal, right? We're forgetting that under the Obama administration, we had this onerous mandate that was eventually the Supreme Court ruled illegal, the Obama's Clean Power Plan, which nudged, that's saying it politely, the utilities to start getting rid of coal. So it wasn't the market. It wasn't like we woke up one day and said, coal's just more expensive, and so let's just start shutting it down. It was this Clean Power Plan that was the culprit. But so there's that. And then back to the point about the reliability of of fuel sources for Texas, had Texas not took the nudge from the federal government to get rid of their coal plants, then you would have reliable coal baseload production. And so, you know, so now you have Texas having to. What was pointed out by the other speaker was Texas having to create all these pipelines for all this natural gas that they're gonna need. And now we're even talking about more for AI and data centers now. And so an added cost, which you didn't have with coal, and then the point about the carbon capture for natural gas, it's not necessarily more expensive. It's because natural gas has less of a amount of CO2 that's emitted, so the stream of CO2 is less. So just like with direct air capture, it's more expensive to capture, but doesn't mean that the natural gas industry shouldn't have been, that mandate shouldn't have been on them as well. But I just wanted to make those points because I think that you know, a tribe is the largest coal owner in the country, and so these attacks against coal are important. That some of that there are some more, you know, truths out there rather than this whole idea that, you know, coal's just expensive and we finally woke up. The issue that we're going to have, and one of the other earlier speakers this morning said that we're going to have peak oil next year potentially, which means we're going to have peak gas too, because most of the new gas that we produced in the U.S. was associated gas, right, produced with oil. So the shale oil with gas, a lot of dry gas. So gas before shale was primarily dry gas, just gas that you went looking for. We haven't really prospected for, so we haven't looked for it, and there's not a lot of production from that anymore. And so we're going to have also probably peak gas too.
Okay.
So
you have a question, sir?
So no, it was a point.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's Professor James Coleman. You talked about the crisis that happened with the snowstorm in Texas. You didn't cover the aspect where, because the Texas grid is isolated from the rest of the interconnected grids, would that have played a role? Your analysis and explanation completely eliminated that portion. So could you shed some light on that?
It could have played a limited role. I think it's important to understand. So it's funny because within the United States, I think we think about the Texas as its own grid. There's an East Coast grid, and there's a West Coast grid, and there's a Texas grid, which makes it seem like, oh, it must be a very small grid. Internationally, it's actually a quite sizable grid. It's a big grid. And so it's possible that around the edges of Texas, it would have helped. It wouldn't have addressed the central problem, which is that basically you would have had outages. And in fact, on many of the edges in the neighboring areas, this wasn't true in El Paso, but on the eastern and northern side, you did have outages as well. So I'm not sure it would have solved the problem. But I do think it points to a broader solution, which is that, you know, as somebody who spent a lot of time talking to Texas policymakers, across the spectrum. I mean, I think there's a naive view, you know, if you don't live in Texas, oh, Texas are a bunch of cowboys. They just don't want federal regulation, et cetera. I would say there may be some truth to that, but it's kind of like they're wind power cowboys. I mean, because basically they are, so I saw no interest across the spectrum from Democrats, Republicans in connecting more because they're afraid of federal regulation, because the rest of the country has to deal with this layered permitting system where you have to satisfy both the federal government and the states, and that creates giant problems for building new transmission, for deploying new power sources. Texas has a very unique approach to connecting with the grid, like Connect and Manage. It makes it much easier for solar and wind farms to be built. And basically no Texan wanted any part of that federal regulation. So I think everybody understands economically it would be better. It might help around the edges of the reliability problem to connect with those other grids, but that because of this problem of federal it's really, I mean, there it's kind of a cost allocation thing. There's a bunch of aspects of it. The people don't want any part of that federal system, which I think says something about, you know, some of the improvements that we may need to make to the permitting system. I also think it's important to understand that, you know, it wasn't, Texas is not the only place. I mean, we saw similar reliability problems in the U.S. Southeast. Now, Spain. I mean, Spain wasn't having. It was a beautiful day in Spain, right? And so this is a problem that's happening to a lot of places that, like Texas, have been successful in building a lot of new renewable power. And frankly, Texas faces a greater degree of difficulty because it's one of the very few places in the wealthy world that is having rapid electricity demand growth. That's not a problem that's widely faced around the world. And Texas has, I mean, has it been successful or not? I mean, that was a giant failure, but it's had huge successes too. And I think for people who follow electricity policy closely, you'll find a million different views on how successful Texas has been in meeting that.
1,700 people a day moving into Texas. So
yeah, it's amazing.
God saves Texas, and please thank our panelists. Good.